So it's 2 minutes past 3 Paris time. So welcome again, everyone who's joining the webinar. I think we can get started. So my name is Rachel Kali, and I'm the Capacity Building Museums and Society Assistant at the International Council of Museums. We're very happy to welcome you today for our webinar on human rights that we're organizing on the occasion of the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We all know that this is our chance more than ever to strengthen our engagement as a global network of museums and museum professionals on issues around human rights. Our main objective today with this webinar is to present you with the tools and practical case studies to illustrate the different ways in which human rights in the museum sector take different forms of action. For that today, we have an incredible panel of speakers. So we have Henry McGee from Curating Tomorrow, Lara Chiavarini and Marina Sala from the Federation of International Human Rights Museums, also known as FIRM. And finally, we have Jane Klinger with us today, the chair of the International Committee of Memorial and Human Rights Museums, also known as ICOM. I would like to remind you all that interpretation is available in French and Spanish today, and do not hesitate to write your questions in the chat for the discussion part of the webinar. So I will present you the agenda for today. We will open the floor with Henry, who will say a few words on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and will take us through the ways in which we can work with human rights in a practical way. Then Lara will talk about the importance of integrating human rights within the educational curriculum in schools. Jane will take us through the work of the International Committee of Memorial and Human Rights Museums, ICOM, and the place that human rights museums have within ICOM. And finally, Henry will take us through concrete steps on how museums and ICOM committees can support and promote human rights. So before we start with the presentations, I will introduce our first speaker. Henry McGee is the founder of Curating Tomorrow, a consultancy for museums and the heritage sector. He's also the author of the Guide on Museums and Human Rights, which touches on why museums should incorporate human rights into their work. So Henry, the floor is now yours to tell us more about it.
Okay, thanks, Rochelle. And if we can move to my next slide, please. Okay, thanks. So just to introduce myself, I'm a museum consultant based in the UK, but working in lots of countries. I'm a member of the NatHist committee, and from 2018 till earlier this year, I was a member of the working group on sustainability. And so one of the things I do is I write a series of open access guides to help museums and their partners and similar institutions to kind of upskill on how they can contribute to sustainable development. And I just show a few of the covers of my guides here. The one on museums and sustainable development goals is used in pretty much every country now. Museums for Better Futures was my Churchill Fellowship project, looking at how we bring together human rights and environmental protection as the twin foundations of sustainable development. But then the last one to mention is the Guide Museums and Human Rights that I wrote in 2020 in the context of the COVID pandemic, as a time when museums were kind of searching around for, how can we look to do things a little bit differently. So we'll move to the next slide, please. And so every year, the 10th of December is commemorated as International Human Rights Day. And this year is extremely important because it's the 75th anniversary of this really momentous document, something that was really one of the great achievements of the 20th century. And there's an initiative that we can all take part in, and I'll talk a bit more about that later on. But just to say that the idea of human rights is a really old one, going back thousands of years. And again, the existence and importance of rights has been stated, often following times of great turmoil. So let's talk now about the declaration itself. And we move to the next slide, please. So here we see Eleanor Roosevelt with a really big copy of the Declaration of Human Rights. And she was one of the main kind of drafters of the declaration. And it was developed from the horrors of the Second World War. The United Nations had been formed 3 years before, working to maintain and build peace everywhere. And the declaration was developed as a kind of a fuller explanation of what, as a kind of code of conduct for people everywhere, as a common standard for all people and all governments and everyone everywhere. And the declaration itself consists of 30 short articles which cover people's different civil and political, economic, social and cultural rights. Next slide, please. And the most famous or the best known of these is that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. They're endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood and sisterhood. And we can say that the declaration is not only for individuals and governments, it's for organizations too, and this means museums. So if we think of some of the rights that are included in the declaration, they're very obviously related to the work of museums. Freedom of expression and the right to information, the right to the truth, the right to education, the right to participate in public affairs, to take part in cultural life, to enjoy the arts and to share in scientific advancement and its benefits, an adequate standard of living for everyone, including museum workers, decent working conditions, a social and international order everywhere, but also to say that we all have duties to the community. Human rights aren't just something that we kind of collect for ourselves. They're about how we relate to one another. And if we can turn to thank you. So since it was developed, usually because there hasn't been enough progress in particular areas, additional agreements have been made because the declaration is not perfect, 75 years old. So as society has developed, new problems have emerged. We see an additional set of international agreements, conventions, which cover different aspects of social challenges. The Convention to End Racial Discrimination, discrimination against women, the rights of the child, persons with disabilities, the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People or on peasants and other people working in rural areas is a slightly strange title, but that's the title that those people chose. And all of these agreements include aspects that are clearly related to the work of museums, and some of them even specifically mention museums in their contents. And more generally, the declaration had been set out that it was to be kept constantly in mind by all organs of society to ensure its fundamental promise was kept and upheld. And unfortunately, this didn't happen, including in sectors, including unfortunately museums, that they haven't addressed human rights as much as they could have. Museums could make much more use of human rights, and this would have many benefits for people and communities, for peace and social progress, but also for museums themselves. And it would be very helpful, very, very beneficial if human rights and rights-based approaches were written more clearly into the work of the museum sector. So how do we work with human rights practically? Well, one of the easiest ways, one of the simplest ways, is to work with the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, which ICOM adopted in 2019, because the 30 rights from the original declaration are spread across the 17 goals. And in fact, all major human rights agreements and environmental protections are also included in this framework. We go to the next slide, please. And so one of the ways that we work with human rights is using this framework, respect, protect, fulfill framework, that we recognize people have rights, and the duty to respect means we just don't get in the way. We don't stand in the way of people claiming their rights. The duty to protect means we don't allow third parties, usually businesses, to interfere with people's rights. And the last one, the duty to fulfill human rights, means we help more people to enjoy, to experience their human rights. So when we work with human rights, we're not providing people with charity or aid. We're just providing them with what we should be providing them in the first place. So we shouldn't really expect, any glory or gratitude, just the satisfaction that we've understood what we should be doing and we've done our best to do it. That's it. It's quite simple. So we go to the next slide, please. And so a really great framework that we use with human rights is called the human rights-based approach. It says that people have rights, but organizations have responsibilities. And the human rights-based approach makes sure that we don't think of this work as a kind of production line where people are at the end of the production line. It's about the organizations and people and communities working together. And the human rights-based approach is really a fantastic thing. Next slide, please. And so back in 1958, Eleanor Roosevelt, one of the architects of the Declaration, she gave a lecture called The Great Question. And there's a quote from it that I absolutely love, that where, after all, do universal human rights begin? In small places close to home, so close and so small that they cannot be seen on any map of the world. Yet they are the world of the individual person, the neighborhood that he or she lives in, the school or college that he or she attends, the factory, farm, or office where he or she works. Such are the places where every man, woman, and child seeks equal justice, equal opportunity, equal dignity without discrimination. Unless these rights have meaning there, they have little meaning anywhere. And without concerted citizen action to uphold them close to home, we shall look in vain for progress in the larger world. And I hope we move to the next slide, please. And so I hope I've shown that museums could be one of these small places, and hopefully some of what I've talked about is useful for you. And if you're interested, you can explore it in the guide that I mentioned. So thank you for your attention, and we can move to the next speaker. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Henry. So our next speakers are Lara and Marina from FIRM. FIRM is an ICOM affiliated organization. Their aim is to create networks of museums and related institutions to address issues of human and civil rights and to address the role of museums as active campaigners to become socially responsible institutions. Lara, the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. Actually, we divided the presentation between Lara and myself, so I'll start. I'm Marina Sala. I'm coordinator for FIRM Global, director of the Museum of Democracy here in Argentina, in Rosario, and director of Foundation for Democracy. We appreciate the summary that Henry provided regarding the declaration's background, context, and structure, because it allows perspective of what has been accomplished so far, the conquests, and all that have been achieved. But look around. The declaration is so far from being a reality. We thought we would learn from the mistakes of the past, but still here we are. It might seem obvious, but it's important to highlight the enormous distance there is between an idea and reality. Because here is where the key role museums can play come in. Museums and every other institution that can make things come true. Bring them from the abstract of the declaration to the reality that changes people's lives. We are very far from fulfilling the declaration's goal to provide a human rights standard for all. Because if we look around, we can see how far we are. It seems that every day we are farther away instead of getting closer. So what do we do? How do we make the declaration a reality? Museums have the chance to be agents of change, places where things happen. If museums can take this role actively, they have the opportunity to change the world. Actually, this is why Museum for Democracy exists. It is the first private museum for democracy in the world. It is one of a kind, based in Rosario, Argentina. And this is why FIRM claims that every museum can be a human rights museum. Because when a museum opens its doors and look around and decides to take a stand, it becomes an active player in the community. And then wonderful things can happen. And when the human rights become political hostage of corrupt governments, museums, if they can extricate themselves from that, they can become a place for change, of rebellion, of activism. More so, civil society organizations or private institutions that have the chance to separate themselves from the often petty actions of governments, they can be of use to the people, to build a network that help defend human rights. I would like to share with you today 2 examples of museums that are taking a stand in terms of human rights, tackling uncomfortable or controversial issues in their permanent or temporary exhibitions, but on a permanent basis. One is Museum for Democracy, the museum I run. It opened to the public in 2019. It was the dream of Guillermo Upey, its president. He truly believes we can do better than this, that we can and must improve democracy. So he spent a decade building this place from scratch. Its goal, to be a place of dialogue and reflection, to incite critical thought, to build a better democracy. It approaches the most urgent dilemmas of contemporary democracy around the world, focusing on what we, each one of us, can do to change the world for the better. No need to be a president or a Nobel Peace Laureate to build peace, and that is what you can see in this museum. The struggles of the past and the present, the many conquests in terms of human rights, and also all that is pending still. Throughout the process of designing this museum, we were often hit with prejudice and skepticism. Who will want to visit a museum for democracy? It will be boring. Nobody will want to spend their free time visiting a museum that talks about all that is wrong in the world. Well, we proved them wrong. The museum today is working at full capacity. This is a message that we need to read very, very carefully. 1, people care. 2, people will come to a museum that invites them to think and reflect. 3, we can talk about rights and also responsibilities, and they will still come. 4, we need more museums that incite reflection on these issues. 5, every museum can be a human rights museum. And then comes the other example I wanted to share with you today. We wanted to have this on video, but it wasn't possible. So I'm going to tell you about it. Because one might think, okay, you have it easy because you were born a human rights museum. It's not that easy to become one might think. The Imagine Museum, a glass art museum. They had a desire to respect, to inspire, uplift, and educate, they say. In 2018, founder, philanthropist, artist, and businesswoman Trish Dugan determined to open a museum in St. Petersburg, Florida, as a way to give back to the community. Her goal was to put together a collection of artworks and promote an experience that would inspire, uplift, and educate. As a woman already working with glass for her personal art, Trish determined that the properties of glass and glass art would provide such an experience. And so she did. She created Imagine Museum. And it ended being so much more than a glass art museum. This is a museum that takes a stand on human rights because Trish Dugan herself does. So she rallies for human rights, and her museum is also a tool for her to showcase not only glass art and artists, but compassion, one of the recent exhibitions, respect, and human rights. So what is Imagine Museum now? It is still a glass art museum, but it is also a human rights museum. What makes Imagine a human rights museum? Their commitment to take a stand when it matters. And the fact that they inspire reflection on human rights through art, an incredibly powerful tool. And as we have been discussing for some time now, I think we can agree now that education is a key role of museums, and not only in their exhibitions does this become a reality, but also in their advocacy strategies, rallying for human rights education in their communities. And here is where teaching the declaration is crucial. We can't defend a right we don't know we have. Lara Chiavarini is the manager of Foundation for Democracy. Lara, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Marina. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone, wherever you are. Thank you for getting online for this webinar. Continuing with what Marina was saying, at FIRM and at the Museum for International Democracy, we strongly believe the Universal Declaration should be a part of the compulsory education curriculum in schools, universities, and educational institutions. We try to do so in our state through the Ministry of Education. we could not achieve it. So we rebelled ourselves. We did it through our permanent exhibition in the main room of the International Museum of Democracy. The Universal Declaration is the cornerstone of the exhibition, and the guides that accompany visitors play a key role here, explaining the articles and their actual application in everyday lives. One huge problem is that most people cannot associate human rights with their everyday life. At Foundation for Democracy, we are currently doing a campaign on social media trying to explain human rights in concrete and daily situations so that everyone actually gets to understand the scope of their rights. But why wouldn't the government commit to the inclusion of human rights in the compulsory education curriculum? Some people could claim that social sciences are discredited against hard science, and the latter should be prioritized. Other people may consider that the inclusion of certain human rights could boost citizens' engagement with public affairs, increasing awareness and activism. This could lead to dissent or opposition against the government's policies. Therefore, this fear of losing control over the narrative may encourage the exclusion of certain topics at schools. Other people may argue that this should be done in or covered in the domestic sphere by parents or families who choose which issues they teach their children, how they teach them, and when to teach them. Some families may find certain themes controversial and would rather not be taught to their kids. But here I pose the following question. Shouldn't we all, as a community, care about one another and reinforce certain values such as empathy, solidarity, and respect? Teaching human rights is a way to teach people that they have superpowers, that they have certain rights and responsibilities just because they are human beings, and no one could take that away from them. And children should learn that from a young age. I absolutely believe that kindness and courage are contagious. Learning about the Universal Declaration is as important as learning math or grammar. It is essential that we demonstrate the long-term benefits of fostering a culture of peace and respect for human rights. In a society that upholds human rights, people experience increased freedom and self-determination. They feel entitled to engage in decision-making processes. Moreover, living in a society that values these rights strengthens the rule of law, ensuring that all individuals are held accountable to identical legal principles and protections. It contributes to social stability, promoting fairness and justice, reducing tensions and violence. Human rights empower individuals and groups to claim for their rights. This can lead to collective growth. Many studies have shown that societies that value diversity and protect individual freedoms are often more innovative and creative. Human rights are a foundation for social justice. They provide a framework for addressing systematic inequalities and determination, helping to create a fairer and more just society. Respect for human rights encourages the creation of diverse and inclusive communities where people from various backgrounds can coexist harmoniously. All in all, it contributes to a more equitable and sympathetic society. I know all of this may sound very idealistic, but I see human rights as the starting point and at the same time the horizon that we aim for. All stakeholders must contribute to the importance of teaching human rights, and this includes museums, so that nobody can state that the resources for education are limited and they should give priority to other subjects with a more practical goal. Museums should open themselves, take a stand, become live and vibrant places where people can talk, debate, and build a better society. They should be a refuge for plural voices in a world where intolerance is on the rise. Museums can and should be spaces of activism. They should be open places for society that needs them. Visitors can be chains of transmissions for the respect, protect, and fulfill framework our colleague Maggie mentioned. They can be ambassadors of change, but it's on us to trigger the visitor's curiosity. Inventive proposals are required to encourage audience involvement outside the visit and the walls of the museums. This is the greatest challenge that the museum proposal should and must overcome. Human rights issues generate a great deal of interest among the general population of all ages, and technology can be a great ally in this crusade. It creates interest and curiosity. It helps to capture the full attention of visitors and to convey powerful messages in a short and concise way. Using games and playfulness, and not only with children, is another alternative. For example, many adults love trivias. Invite them to play. Invite them to reconnect with their infant and curious side to continue learning, to test their knowledge, to rethink controversial and crucial issues. I would like to share with you a video of an NGO who has been committed to teaching youth about human rights, specifically the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and inspire them to become advocates for tolerance and peace.
Hello, my name is Raúl Arias. I am from Mexico, and I am the president of Youth for Human Rights Latin America. Youth for Human Rights International is a non-profit organization with presence in more than 150 nations, and our purpose is to teach human rights to youth, specifically the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and to inspire them to become advocates for tolerance and peace. I am very honored to be able to participate in this very important event. Thank you very much. In September of 1945, World War II ended. And then on October of the same year, October 24, the United Nations were formed. And the purpose was to prevent mankind to ever suffer again from the horrors of war. However, more than 75 years later, we'll still see war almost every day. And we see human rights violations every day. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted on December 10, 1948. This year will be 75 years old. And this was the solution of people of goodwill so that something like World War II would never happen again. It was inspired in the atrocities of World War II. It became the most widely accepted human rights document in the world. It is actually the inspiration of more than 80 international human rights treaties. However, and sadly, almost no one knows about it. We did a survey in the whole world, and 90% of the people haven't even heard about the Universal Declaration and are unable to name more than 3 of the 30 universal rights contained on this valuable document. But what are we trying to do? To have everybody learn word by word the 30 articles? That's not the point. But we have seen that if we teach the principles contained in those articles, we can see that we can start creating a better world. That's why Youth for Human Rights has created easy to use educational materials, easy to use and easy to understand educational materials like human rights courses, this human rights booklet that is a simplified version of the Universal Declaration, because when we teach to youth, we are planting seeds on fertile soil. And they can see by understanding the concept contained in these articles that yes, it's important to know your human rights because then you can defend them. And you can defend them not just for yourself, but all your fellow human beings. If these rights are not true, are not a reality for all of our fellow human beings, the fact is that they're never going to be a reality for ourselves. But also, if we understand them, we can see that they apply in the day-to-day life, in the decisions we make, how we treat each other. And that's how we can create a renaissance for this civilization. And this is why Youth for Human Rights supports all the organizations, all the individuals that want to include human rights education. Because when we ask the question, who is going to solve the huge gap between the ideal written in the declaration and the reality that we see every day, who is going to fix that gap? I think the answer starts with education. Nelson Mandela said, education is the most powerful weapon that you can use to change the world. And this is where we want to say that the job that the museums do every day in all parts of the world is vital for the survival of this civilization, in particular human rights museums. Thank you for what you do, because it's the best way to plant that seed on that fertile soil in the life of a young person, where we can still impact the destiny of that life. That is the way to form and to create that renaissance of a new civilization. Thank you very much for the job you do. All the museums, and in particular, all the human rights museums in the world. Youth for Human Rights International is always happy and willing to help in your very vital mission. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lara and Marina, for these inspiring presentations and for sharing these initiatives with us. We will now move on to the next presentation. Jane Klinger is the chair of the International Committee for Memorial and Human Rights Museums, also known as ICMemory. Committees as ICMemory are global think tanks on museums and heritage issues. They define the museum professional standards, share scientific information, establish partnership with other organizations, and develop recommendations for ICOM members. Jane, the floor is now yours.
Hello, and thank you for inviting me to speak. We can go on to the next slide and the video. And you can go on to the next slide. So our name change was a logical outgrowth of our founding rules and our charter. In every paragraph of the documents are found references to human rights and the call to explore, uphold, and educate the public about them. We therefore proposed our name change, which was approved by the ICOM Executive Board last June, for these three main reasons: to make explicit what is already within our committee's mandate, to provide clarity of purpose, and to inform the wider community of museum professionals that human rights museums have a defined place within ICOM. So the summary of our mission is as follows. In remembrance of the victims of public crimes and of the violations of human rights, our focus is in the presentation of historical and contemporary events that are grounded in scholarship and are community-centered. Next slide, please. We closely partner with a wide variety of institutions, think tanks, universities, NGOs, government agencies, and this by any means is not an exhaustive list, but we're all working towards the same goal. Next slide. And that brings me to describe just a little bit of what we do. Most recently, we held our annual conference in Madrid. We participated as guests of the Spanish Ministry of the Presidency, Court Relations, and Democratic Memory in the European Union Conference, Cultural Policies on Memory for a Democratic Europe. We also held, in conjunction with that conference, an IC memory meeting to discuss the role of memorial and human rights museums in promoting truth, justice, and reparations for an equitable future. And just at the beginning, go back one, please. And just at the beginning of this month, about 10 days ago, we convened an expert meeting where deep and difficult conversations were held with Ukrainian colleagues regarding not only their responses and resilience to the war, but their efforts to retain the right to a national and cultural identity. Now we can move forward. At the Prague Triennial, we built on an earlier webinar addressing political pressure on museum professionals. We discussed the various forms that can take through insistence on a particular interpretation of events to suppressing the truth. Next slide. And several years ago, we held an important roundtable on women's rights in Nigeria. One of the outcomes was the development of Art for Women's Rights, an interactive digital museum which aims to raise awareness through art and personal stories of the plight of Nigerian women. We hope to further develop and add to the site in the near future about a range of issues affecting women's rights around the world. And next slide. IC Memory, the ICOM, International Committee of Memorial and Human Rights Museums, was founded on the principle that violations of human rights lead to public crimes in remembrance of which memorial museums are founded. Both memorial and human rights museums strive to foster an understanding of the importance of upholding human rights for a democratic and equitable society. As the ICOM committee with a focus on human rights, IC Memory recognizes the importance of this 75th anniversary of the UN Declaration of Human Rights. On this occasion, we are all being asked to pledge to a specific action that supports the promotion and protection of human rights. I'd like to thank you for listening, and we hope that you will join us in making the pledge.
Thank you very much, Jane. And thank you to all of our speakers today for these very insightful presentations. Now we'll have a look at the next steps and how we, as a network of museums and museum professionals, can concretely commit to human rights. Henry will elaborate on the campaign that was put in place on the occasion of the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So Henry, the floor is yours again.
Thanks, Rochelle. And it's fantastic to hear that from the different speakers, different perspectives of the many, many different ways that museums and museum organizations and ICOM can contribute to human rights for all everywhere. So Human Rights 75 is an initiative that's been running all this year, but it's not had such a lot of profile. But it's trying to encourage people and organizations to commit or recommit to human rights as a common standard for all people. And there are lots of resources available to help. And in particular, you can make a 100-word pledge, which is your statement of what you will do to respect, protect, and fulfill human rights. It's really easy, and organizations of all kinds can take part, and that includes museums of all kinds, includes ICOM as a whole organization. And I've made a pledge for my own organization. It's really simple. And it's also really a great opportunity to show the range of things that museums are already doing or that they plan to do, and to use that to kind of, you know, raise ambition for the future. So if we go to the next slide, please. So this is the link for the what's called the Push for Pledges, where you make a up to 100 words pledge about what you're going to do to support human rights over the coming year or longer. And we'll share the link there. That's great, thank you. And then if you go to the next slide, please. There are also lots of resources that you can use, including resources to share with the public under this heading, to take action for human rights. I'll just show you the image that's shown on the slide there is just what the website looks like, and the links are on the right-hand side of the website. So there are a lot of resources there, like social media images and GIFs and cards and things that you can use. There are the hashtags, hashtag human rights 75 or hashtag UDHR 75. And if you can get these in before the 10th of December, these pledges, then they will be read out on, there's to be a high-level event at the United Nations on the 11th and 12th when all of the pledges will be read out. So why not take part? You know, there's nothing to lose and there's everything to gain. And as we've heard, you know, in different ways, that the challenges are, you know, we have this same challenges and new challenges, bigger challenges, more complex challenges, but also massive opportunities for us to take part. So let's do what we can. So that's all I would like to say. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Henry. So we're pretty much ahead of schedule. So we can have a look at, we can have a little discussion. We have a question in the chat, but I think that Henry's explanation of the pledge replied to it. Maybe we can discuss about the challenges that museums commonly face when integrating human rights in their activities. So maybe each of you can tell us, how can museums overcome the challenges they face in integrating human rights in their institutions? Maybe, I don't know if Marina and Lara, yeah?
Yes, of course. I think one of the most crucial challenges there is to overcome the fear of being syndicated with a singular point of view on something. And I think that nowadays there are things about human rights that nobody can deny. In our country and in many countries as our own, the problem is that human rights are being held hostage by corrupt governments. And when you talk about human rights, you often find yourself being aligned with a government that you don't agree with. So, and that is the reason why many museums hesitate when taking a stand on human rights, because it's very confusing, and it's the fear of being syndicated as pro a corrupt government is one of the threats of this. We found that, you know, during our work, that it's often very hard to take a stand, but the public appreciates it and ends up understanding the challenge of taking a stand. And it ends up being so valuable that a museum can speak up in favor of human rights that it always wins. For us, it can be easier maybe because we're a private museum, and as a private museum that doesn't receive any financial help from the government whatsoever, we are free to speak our mind. That is not the case in every museum, so it's harder to take a stand when you depend on financial support. I think there are creative ways of taking a stand that doesn't, it is not always necessary to hold an exhibition of something to take a stand. You can also use your agenda, your activities, the things that you do, the things that you invite people to do, and you can take a stand there. Start small and start speaking up. I mean, there's no lying to this. I think it's hard. I think it's really hard to take a stand, and particularly when you depend on financial support. But what's the point if we don't? I mean, why do we exist if we can't do that?
Thank you very much. We have a question in the chat, so maybe this could be a question for you, Jane. What is the true role of the museum in light of the new ICOM definition of museums in terms of thinking about the rights of, about the human rights?
Well, the first thing that comes to my mind is the focus on being community-centered and addressing the needs of the community, as was just said. That can be difficult if funding is coming from a government or an entity that is going in a different direction. But yes, creative solutions can be found and need to be found. Because I keep thinking about it, it's so much on my mind of due to our recent meeting with Ukrainian museum directors and other personnel, how they have responded to the war, which is a very extreme pressure on one's identity and cultural heritage, in spite of having to place the museum collections in as safe a storage as they can find. They have found ways to address the needs of the community and reinforce community and cultural identity and their rights to express themselves fully as Ukrainians, that may refer to the collections but aren't central to the collections and take place on museum property or near the museum, which includes some of the cultural entities have begun for the first time recording oral histories, and it really gives voice to the people the museum and cultural institutions are there to serve.
Thank you very much, Jane. And are there any ongoing projects or initiatives within IC Memory that museums and members can participate in at the moment?
Within IC Memory or within ICOM? Within
IC Memory.
Actually, yes. First of all, if you have ideas for and what we should include as a pledge or a series of pledges for this call, you can certainly email secretary.icmemory@icom.museum, and we'll take a look. And when we have the full discussion at our next meeting, which will be hopefully towards the end of this month, we will collate all of your ideas and put that together. And another is to watch for call for papers. One will be coming out very soon. We're in a little bit of an uncomfortable position in that we do not have as much time as we would like to plan our next meeting. And I'm not in a position to announce where and when that will be, but watch for the call to come out and participate. We welcome you. We don't restrict. We certainly, like other international committees, we don't restrict only to our members. We are also expanding our membership because only recently has human rights museums been forefronted on with our identity. And I know in the United States, I've been working hard and have gotten the interest of many of the memorial and civil rights museums that are American. If you know of others for us to contact, please do. We spread our net far and wide and welcome any ideas you have. And also we will be doing a series of webinars over the coming years. So.
Thank you very much, Jane. So we see raised hands. It would be better if you would write your questions in the chat and then we will read them out loud. I have a question for Henry. Can you provide more details, maybe coming from the guide, on how museums can officially commit to human rights?
Yeah, sure. I think I'll also like to say something about, in relation to some of the previous questions that I've heard, that often when we think about human rights in museums, it's after the worst challenges have arisen. But we can think about human rights, in every museum, everywhere, because working with human rights is, in a way, how we avoid tension escalating, because conflict is a normal part of human life. People have different views, different values, and so on. But violence is only one of the possible outcomes of conflict. How can we work to manage conflict in a productive and constructive way? And so I think this is the way I like to think about how we use human rights. We use them we use them in a very practical way. And so for your question there, Rochelle, about how do we bring human rights, practically into our work, in terms of basically across all of our activities, you can think about it like mainstreaming human rights, what we collect and how, what we educate people about and how and why, which social groups we put more effort on including into our activity, how we make sure that every decision we make every day is supporting people's rights and not undermining them. For instance, in terms of how we employ people, who made the things that we sell in our shops, who grew the coffee and the chocolate that we sell in our cafes, and which partners do we choose to work with. And I think these activities can help make a really solid kind of framework so that each of our museum activities has human rights considerations embedded within it.
Thank you very much. Maybe any one of you can reply to the next questions. No, maybe this is a question for Lara or Marina, is how can museums effectively incorporate human rights education in their public programs and exhibitions?
Marina, do you take it or should I take it?
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay, first of all, one major thing is to have obviously an educational team. That's like the obvious and the goal. But in case you don't have an educational team, you can think little actions in your everyday exhibitions. And also, you can also think about other activities that can be shown. For example, we recently had a workshop about graphic humor at our museum, and we related it to the 40 years of democracy in our country. So there are little activities that can somehow put human rights in the agenda for people that visit the museum, or to encourage people who maybe wouldn't visit your museum to go there. And it's like a linkage through an activity which they may find interesting, and that will take them to the museum. So I believe there are little things that can be done in your agenda where you can like insert human rights. I don't know if that answered the question. Mari, I don't know if you can also add something here.
If I can add to your answer, I would say there is educational purpose in a lot of things. Not necessarily an exhibition, not necessarily a booklet or a conference, or there is educational purpose in many things. For example, the mediators of a museum, the guides that walk people around, that answer questions at the museum, the reception, the billboards or visual communication that you might have that can be changed, and in the entrance when you walk into the museum, there are many small things that you can do that are educational, and maybe they're not such a huge effort for the museum, but you're saying something through that. So I think there's educational purpose in many things.
Thank you very much. Maybe we can have a last question before ending this webinar. And it could be a question for any one of you. What steps can museums take to ensure that their human rights initiatives are accessible and inclusive to people with diverse backgrounds and abilities? Maybe Henry, you can start.
Yeah, sure, because I think this is one of the situations when we can use the human right, what I mentioned, the human rights-based approach. Because like in the worst way, the museum just makes assumptions about people, what people with particular needs want, and then it provides them, and then surprise, surprise, it's not what they wanted. And that just doesn't work. The human rights-based approach is saying that, well, people have these rights, but the way the institution is currently operating also creates some barriers. So the only way we can understand the barriers we create is by talking to the people about, what is it that, what could we do that differently or better that helps to break down that broken system. So this is one of the things of the human rights-based approach is really a great tool. It makes sure that those who are going to be using particular activities or services of a museum or anyone else have had a hand in shaping those activities. So I think just to say there as well that one of the great benefits of working with human rights and rights-based approaches is that museums don't have to make it all up themselves. So like human rights education that we spoke about before, there's a whole pedagogy for human rights education. We don't have to reinvent it. We can just bring this into museum work. And so I think that's what I would say is that the human rights approaches, they actually provide us with access to many resources and approaches that are really great.
Great, thank you. I don't know if the other speakers want to add something to this question. No. Okay. Well, I think we can end the webinar here. I would like to say a big thank you to all the speakers, Jane, Lara, Marina, and Henry. Thank you for these very insightful presentations and content. And thanks to all of you who joined the webinar today. The webinar is recorded, so it will be available online shortly after. So yeah, thanks to all of you, and bye-bye.
Thank you. Cheerio.